Welcome to The Teaching Curve, a podcast exploring the pedagogy of global politics and international studies, produced under the auspices of the International Studies Association and made available through ISA's Professional Resource Center. I'm Jamie Free, Associate Provost and Professor of Global Politics at Bridgewater College. Each episode of The Teaching Curve is a conversation with a thoughtful and engaged teacher of international studies. The goal is to celebrate and inspire pedagogical creativity by helping IR teacher scholars explore the intricacies of practices that, for most of us, determine the professional impact we have on the world. Investing in improving our teaching practices and assessing their effectiveness are activities best done in deliberation with others navigating similar terrain. Providing fora for those conversations is one of the most consequential services an organization like ISA can provide for its members. Today's conversation is with Dr. Misbah Hyder, a visiting assistant professor in the Teaching Excellence Center at the United States Naval War College in Rhode Island. She consults with faculty there and, among other things, trains instructors in trauma-informed teaching in professional military education environments. She is co-editor with Michael Murphy on a forthcoming volume, Teaching Political Science and International Relations for Early Career Instructors. Our conversation explores how Misbah leveraged the study of pedagogy into a fulfilling institutional role supporting the development of colleagues as teachers, the concept of trauma-informed teaching and how adopting it shifts perspectives on pedagogy, and specific trauma-informed teaching tactics that make a difference in both the content and the practice of IR courses. Dr. Misbah Hyder, thank you very much for coming to be part of the Teaching Curve. I'm very happy to have you here to talk about this topic.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
So the first question I always ask to people has to do with trying to position themselves and place themselves for all of us so we can think about how their experiences might relate to our own. So the question I ask is, who are your students? And I know you kind of have a different sort of answer to that question.
Yeah, thanks. So because I work at teaching centers right now, which basically for anyone who doesn't know what teaching centers are, right? My brother always likes to describe it as I teach teachers how to teach, right? And so that's basically what the job entails, right? I do a lot of workshops, I do faculty consultations and observations, and I give faculty quite a bit of feedback on their teaching as they seek it, right? Previously, I had worked at Notre Dame as a postdoc, in which I was more focused on graduate students. So right now, my role is a visiting assistant professor at the Teaching Excellence Center at the U.S. Naval War College, and so I work with the faculty there, and so the nature of the institution and the nature of who's present there is quite a different context, even if the bulk of the teaching and how to teach and what types of pedagogy we talk about generally are consistent from other civilian higher ed institutions.
You have a doctorate in international relations, yeah. So it's interesting to me that your career has moved into this where you're really focused on the pedagogy piece of that.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about about that choice, that trajectory, how you got where you are.
Yeah. And this is where I really think that teaching centers are such a ripe and fertile environment for PhDs to be in, and that we just don't know about this career trajectory enough. So at UC Irvine, which is where I did my doctorate, I actually worked within this program, this experiential learning program called the Olive Tree Initiative, in which we would, teach students about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and then take them to the region over the summers. And so I had found this UC-wide grant for us to be able to develop this as a UC-wide online course. So because we were expanding our program like across the UCs and we wanted to institutionalize the curriculum further. And so when we got the grant, part of the grant was to work with learning designers in the teaching center at UC Irvine to be able to develop the Canvas page and the modules and the learning pathways and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So all of this jargon that I just used right now, I had no idea what any of that was. And so it was the learning designers who, part of part of the fact of me being a graduate student, right, was that I was the one working with them the most and consulting with the faculty. So I was like the bridge
Yeah.
between the faculty and the learning designers, which allowed me to learn so much about curriculum development, about how to be able to build canvas, not just canvas pages, but how to think about learning outcomes and then create learning pathways toward assessment, backward course design, things like that.
Right.
So really learned a lot about pedagogy through that experience. And then it was through that that I even knew that the teaching center even existed.
Right.
And then there's this pedagogical fellowship program that we have at UC Irvine, in which students who are really interested in pedagogy get to take a year-long series of courses that are training, like teaching us about learning science. And then we do a TA training for our specific departments. And so that's how I got my hand in training. And this was also like around, so we were I think the second COVID cohort. And so the academic market was terrible and people were losing, like getting jobs pulled from them. And I was
Yeah.
having a lot of anxiety because I was, really close to being on the market. And so then I spoke with my mentor where I was like, how can I be you when I grow up? And so then like that question alone, opened up pathways of, he told me this career is called educational development and we have our own professional network and we have teaching center jobs and here's where you can find them, and
Yeah.
really guided me through that process. It was just really through my love of pedagogy, but also just some opportunities that my
Yeah.
institution had that I was able to take advantage of. And then through that, finding mentors who were able to sort of guide me in that pathway. And then I thought it was just going to be one teaching center job, and then I was going to move on to, more traditional academic positions, which I still might, but this has become such a fruitful pathway for me to be able to still work on my own research, my
Yeah.
own disciplinary research on IR, while also being able to work on pedagogy within IR
Yeah.
as well, or and pedagogy in general. And
For
so it's
sure.
been really fun.
So, yeah, and let's talk about that. That's because one of the things that you've been able to, I don't know if you would call it specialize in, but to really dig into is this idea of trauma-informed teaching, which is
Yeah.
becoming more and more prevalent for lots of ways of defining and thinking about how students might have experienced trauma and how to teach them, even though that's the case. So talk to me first a little bit about what we mean when we say trauma-informed teaching.
Yeah, so when we talk about trauma-informed teaching, what we're really talking about is how to be able to recognize the impact of trauma within a classroom. That's
Mhm.
very like that as a very basic sort of definition of it. But there are a variety of ways in which trauma can show up within a classroom. For example, students can have difficulty focusing, they can miss classes, they might have a fear of taking risks, they might feel this sort of sense of helplessness, they might withdraw, right? And these are all effects that we're not having as faculty in the classroom,
Mhm.
right? It's not,
Right.
it can be due to our content, which that's a separate issue, and we can talk about that. But this framework is more so thinking about students as whole people,
Yeah.
right? Students who have experienced various forms of adversity within their lives, how that might show up within our classroom, even if it has nothing to do with what we're teaching.
Yeah. So what do you mean when you say trauma?
The definition that I like to use is results from an event, series of events, or circumstances that's experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening that has, and this is the part that's most important, lasting adverse effects on the
Mm.
individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being.
Mm.
Right? So these could be a variety of different circumstances. So this could, I think what we most associate with trauma, it might be acute trauma or what we call like PTSD. There are other levels of trauma that we don't account for. So
Mhm.
one is sort of individual identity or complex trauma. So folks call it like CTSD, right? Like complex trauma, in which it's more like, if the way that I like to think about it is like PTSD might be like a big wound, right? One thing has happened to you in which that has opened up a huge wound.
Right.
Meanwhile, complex trauma are just little cuts over and over again. And they
Mhm.
might be on the same place and therefore it gets deeper, or it might just be everywhere.
Yeah.
Right? And they're just little cuts that you constantly have to deal with. And then the other one, which I think is the reason why we're thinking about trauma informed, which is why I went into trauma informed pedagogy myself, was collective trauma or continuous
Mm.
traumatic
Mm.
stress, which is right. We can think about the continuing global 19, COVID-19 global
Yeah.
pandemic. We can think about, particularly, in 2020, the rise of discourses about Black Lives Matter, right? We can think about the Trump presidency, right? We can think about immigration and detention centers, right? A variety of different things, and global climate change,
Mhm.
right? There are a variety of different things that are going on as collectives, right, that are impacting the ways in which we are experiencing our lives and
Yeah.
connecting with one another. And for all of the latter issues that I just mentioned, these are all issues that we discuss within our IR classrooms,
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point. Yeah, the stuff you're bringing up, if somebody experiences those things in a traumatic way, as you say, let's talk about how these things work.
Exactly.
That may impact some students very differently than other students.
When we're bringing up climate change within our courses, which we
Mm.
should be talking about climate change, right? We can think through how students might be responding. There's all this anxiety, there's withdrawal, there's helplessness, right? There, these types of emotional responses might
Yeah.
occur within the classroom. So this is where I'm talking about, like, where topics that we're discussing, right, have these impacts. But even when I talk with chemistry faculty, right, I'm like, trauma matters in your classroom too,
Sure.
because your students are still living in this world, right? They're still full human beings, and they don't check their lives out the door when they enter your classroom. And so you don't know what's going on in their lives and how they might be responding to you. So for example, when students ask for accommodations, right? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt,
Uh-huh.
rather than saying that they're just seeking a better grade, or they're just, trying to get out of doing work, right? Which is often the assumption that we start with. And then students have to justify.
Yeah.
Why not give students the benefit of the doubt, right? And that, giving students the benefit of the doubt and not putting them in a mode of being defensive, right, is not re-triggering traumatic, trauma responses.
What tactics do you use to attend to students' traumas in your classes?
Sure. So maybe what I'll do first is I'll sort of talk about the various principles of trauma informed pedagogy. So first is safety. Second is trustworthiness. Third is choice. Fourth is collaboration. And fifth is empowerment. Those are actual principles that are taken from healthcare, trauma informed healthcare.
Mm. Mhm.
So some of the results that we found from my course was that students co-developed a sense of safety by engaging in respectful peer dialogue on various religious and controversial issues. And then they also collaborated with one another to have a deeper understanding of the course material. It was all about how I structured the learning environment. So what happened was that participation was graded. I was very transparent about how it was graded.
Mhm.
And then I had, right after class, I had my office hours on Tuesdays. And then on Thursdays, I had this thing called muddiest point hours.
Mhm.
And so what that basically meant, what a muddiest point means, is like what's most confusing for students. So the design of it was that this is an ungraded space in which I'm not taking attendance. I don't care how much you talk. I don't care if you're just there just to listen. right?
Mhm.
I was very explicit with students about that. But I will just be present. You can ask me anything that's confusing to you about the reading, some term that I didn't cover in class that's still confusing to you, which is why I did it right on Thursday, so that like we're done with the week.
Mm.
What is still in your mind? And I actually found a lot of students would just show up just to see what questions other students would ask,
Sure.
because they were just so interested. What I also found was half of the time I wasn't even answering questions, because students, because this was on Zoom, so students would ask a question and then I would see a student go like that. And so I was like, okay, why don't you answer the question then? And then
Ah,
I would just sit back. And most of the time, like it was like maybe 30 or 40 minutes where I just wouldn't even speak, because the students were just, engaging with one another. And in the reflections that my co-authors had read, they found that multiple students had cited these particular hours as being most generative, right? Because to them it was very informal.
mhm.
I was merely present, but for them it was a way for them to be able to connect with their classmates. And so they collaborate, like that was a way in which they were able to collaborate with one another, which was sort of a byproduct. But the ways in which I structured it was one in which I wanted to garner safety.
Yeah.
I don't like the term safe space that much. I like using brave space a little bit more,
Yeah.
because it asks students to come out of their comfort zone. I wanted them to be uncomfortable, right? But structure an environment such that they felt okay in being more uncomfortable. So
Right.
that was one. um Another thing that I did was to establish trustworthiness, was that I actually did quite a bit of self-disclosure, which I know a lot of faculty have a lot of discomfort about, which I think it's very, very valid.
Yeah.
For me, for a religion and politics course, in which I will say some of my self-disclosure might have been motivated by a tad bit of imposter syndrome, in which, students are looking at me being like, you're this brown woman, right, trying to tell us how religion is supposed to matter,
Uh,
right? Like how am I supposed to believe anything that you're saying? And so what I did was I was like, okay, in the first week of class, I told them I come from a Muslim background. My parents are Pakistani. And then this is how. And then when we talked about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, I said, this is what I was taught as a child about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is
yeah.
how it impacted how I've always seen the conflict. This is how I sought to educate myself beyond those narratives, so that I could diversify the ways in which I seek to analyze particular issues.
Mhm.
Right? So I did that of my own, and I modeled that to students. But then I also didn't ask them to do it right away.
Right.
I put them on the spot to have them do the exact same thing. Instead, I just put it out there. And then throughout the discussions, throughout the course, I saw that students ended up modeling that. Right? They ended up saying through. So now, because I come from this Hindu background, I now, look at because we were talking about the third gender within India, the
Mhm.
hijra. And so he was like, as someone who comes from a Hindu background, here's blah 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 blah, right? So it was really fascinating to see the
Mm.
way in which students ended up taking on that model of self-disclosure, which I think really developed a sense of trust between me and the students. Because then they also saw that I wasn't an all-knowing person who just was born with these various different perspectives. I had to work at it.
Yeah.
And I told them how I worked at it, because my primary learning objective was critical self-reflection. I modeled critical self-reflection to them. And I think that allowed us to be able to gain some trust.
What if your primary learning objective, though, is they have to understand, I don't know, realism?
Mhm.
In order to move beyond and take their upper level courses, they need to understand these 5 theories. And how does trauma informed teaching affect that kind of approach?
Yeah. So So in terms of the trust, right, the trustworthiness doesn't just have to be with regard to the content itself. It could also be in how you structure the assessments, right? So trustworthiness really is, I mean, if you know tilt, which is transparency in teaching and learning,
Yeah.
or learning and teaching, um it's basically talking about how we want to be transparent with our students, right? How we want to make sure that when we are grading, right, what are we grading for? I remember we
Mhm.
actually had this discussion in our panel about whether we should grade for grammar or not, and whether grammar matters, right? So if we're not teaching students grammar, should we be grading them based on grammar? And whichever side of the debate you're on, right? I'm often on the side of the debate where I'm like, it's fine. I don't care. I'm not asking. I'm like, because these were reflection assignments,
Yeah.
right? So for me, them writing a research paper was not. It wasn't the assessment. So therefore, grammar didn't matter for the assessment itself, and therefore, I didn't find it to be a skill that I needed to grade them on. And
Yeah.
I was transparent about that. But whenever I do have research assignments, right, in which they're supposed to give me analytical thinking and analytical writing, not only do I tell them that I'm going to grade based on grammar, but I'm also going to provide them with resources on
Mhm.
how to be able to develop their grammar for the writing center, or do peer review
Yeah.
with, or something like that, right? So the ways in which we build trust and safety within the class, I think a lot of times are about the choices that we're making, and treating students like adults in saying, here's the choice that I've made, here's why I've made that choice, right? And then that way students, when they come to you, if they have an issue, they also understand the justification behind your own choices,
Yeah.
and or are able to come to you with more directed requests, right? Because they understand what your learning objective was and why, and how it connects to the assessment. They're able to say, okay, based on the fact that this is what your goal is for me,
Mm.
right, here's my request. Now if students aren't going to be that thoughtful, you can at least guide them to that process and
Yeah.
say, I understand that you have this broader request. Given the learning objective, here's what I can do for you, right? And just
Yeah.
being really transparent with students about your process, I think builds that
And
trust.
so in many ways, what I'm hearing are the kind of echoes of where you started with this, which was, look, you see students as whole people who come in with all of their, I mean, some people call it baggage, right? But all of their experiences,
Yeah,
all of their previous approaches to education, and your job is to have some awareness, some empathy with the students in your class about how they're encountering your style as a professor, as a teacher, as an instructor, and
especially
help them make sense of that, right?
absolutely. And especially if in the previous period they just had math,
Yeah.
right? And that math professor is making completely different choices, right? It's
Yeah.
hard for them to be able to switch into knowing the justifications for your choices if they're not told that very explicitly.
Right. And
And this is
so,
really where the hidden curriculum comes in, right? Making the implicit explicit,
yes.
right? So if we make the implicit explicit for each of our courses, then when students are walking in, they know what they're walking into. Students feel very emotionally charged about their grades. It's deeply personal to them. This is what they think and is accurate oftentimes, that it's
Yeah.
going to determine the rest of their lives, and they feel a lot of pressure. And so for them, if we can ease some of that pressure by making things more explicit for them, I think that really helps um them feel a little bit more comfortable within the learning environment, such that we can then make them uncomfortable about the topics,
Yeah.
right? Because we don't want them to be uncomfortable about everything, because otherwise the discomfort I then think is going to be misdirected,
Yeah.
right? And
So,
then the sort of final sort of parts of trauma informed pedagogy are choice and empowerment. So we ultimately, when folks feel helpless and have a fear of taking risks and are in this avoidance stage, right, and stuff like that, we want them to be able to make choices. So my favorite thing actually is having one session toward the end of the class that students can have up to a vote. So I would always like provide, and it's not a free-for-all. I give them choices. I give them
Right.
3 or 4 choices, but they vote, and then ultimately they feel more like, okay, I had a choice in my learning. I had students choose the modality in which they would provide the reflections, and so they could either write, which is most students, they did written reflections, but many students did audio and video reflections because they just found that they processed better.
Yeah.
For that, because again, for me, writing wasn't part of the assessment, it was the reflection.
Right.
So it's also understanding our own learning objectives in order to be able to see what choices we can have students make,
Right.
and then empower them to be able to make those choices.
Right. Which is ultimately, I think, the purpose of an education in
Right.
our culture is to turn out agents who feel comfortable making choices about things, and
That's
and
exactly right.
being able to be metacognitive about that, to be thinking about their processes. And so modeling that as an instructor and building that into the way we have in relationships with students sounds like not just good for people who are coming in with trauma, but for everybody. And that
And
gets at another conversation about universal design and all that kind of stuff. But
exactly. I think the part is the humanity of students, right? Of
mhm,
being able to emphasize the humanity of students, but it's just repackaging the same good pedagogy that all of us have been doing. These types of frameworks are really helpful in being able for folks to put language to what they're doing.
it's a great way to end. People who invest in their pedagogy, and having these terminologies to be able to talk with their colleagues about it and talk to their students about what's going on, all of that ultimately ends up with more conscious, thoughtful teaching. So
That's right.
thank you, Ms. Bud. That's fantastic. I really appreciate you coming and talking about that.
Thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
The Teaching Curve podcast is made available in video and audio only versions at the Professional Resource Center webpage of the International Studies Association. Audio versions can be found on all major podcast platforms. You can send feedback or suggestions for future interviews to teachingcurve@isanet.org and follow us on X @teachingcurve. Thank you all for joining us again on the Teaching Curve, and remember, learn something every time you teach.